1. You are free to roll your eyes at this point. 2. Some of you may have noticed an apparent contradiction between my first piece of advice around hooks and A Game of Thrones, that the prologue there had no immediate relevance to the first chapter. What should be understood here is that there are numerous reasons a prologue might work or be necessary. However, G.R. Martin may have also used his prologue to establish the fantasy thread of the story that he wished readers to know about before leaping into medieval realism. 3. Also, if I might add a personal note, it is simply stupid. Overall, it feels out of sync with the rest of the story. 4. Though, it should be noted that many regard the revelation that Macbeth is to be killed by a man born of Caesarean as markedly underwhelming. J.R.R. Tolkien was among them. This was partly his inspiration for the destruction of the Witch King in The Return of the King. The Witch King faced a similar prophecy about his death, and so Tolkien thought it more fitting to have him killed by a hobbit, not fully a man in the sense it is often used of the race of men, and a woman, Eowyn, not a man in the sense often used to male. He also disliked Shakespeare's use of prophecy regarding how Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Burnham would to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. He felt robbed to see an army simply dress up with branches. And thus, the last march of the Ents on Isengard. 5. As a side note, the first season of The Legend of Korra would have been best adapted into a 3-season-long story, with this moment placed later in the narrative. The first season would end with Korra defeating Amorn in Republic City, but the way she defeats him would inspire more anti-Bender sentiment across the world. We could almost make it such that Amorn planned to be defeated as a way to inflame non-Benders. More equalist revolutions would spark across the world, and the Avatar would have to travel as she tries to put them down. The second act would have a more classic journey structure. The second season would end with an attempt at defeating Amorn, only to have Korra lose her bending. This would give the story more time to establish Amorn as a threat given that he actually wins to the world, but more importantly, it would change the third season. Korra would spend it learning to come to terms with being a non-bender after she had defined herself as a bender her whole life. This would lead to a spiritual enlightenment, which in turn would unlock her airbending abilities. In the first season, she unlocks them because Mako is in danger, and that is it. It feels cheap and unearned. She never truly had a spiritual awakening. This would make this moment far more powerful, Amorn a more dangerous antagonist, and Korra's character arc clearer, and more enlightening. 6. This is what Superman v. Batman was based on but utterly failed to live up to. What frustrates me is that the mistakes Snyder and DC are making with their films are simple writing mistakes. The entire Zod Doomsday Wonder Woman Luthor story could be wholly removed, and we would lose nothing of importance. It would have been a far more coherent and interesting story to have Batman legitimately believe Superman is a threat, Superman to be too cozy with the authorities, and to have them fight over these legitimate moral positions. The story could even end in Martha, and I wouldn't be too annoyed if everything else made sense. 7. I did not wish to include this in the main body of writing because I have already used Batman and the Joker way too many times, but I truly do admire Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan's writing in The Dark Knight. The Joker forces Batman to use a morally questionable system of surveillance that causes Lucius Fox to turn on him. Luke does also have a primary conflict. He has to resist giving into the dark side and killing Darth Vader. He manages to do so, and this is what causes the Emperor to turn on him. In a sense, this did also decide the fate of the final battle, given that if he did give in, Darth Vader would be a smoking pile of electronics with a far more serious breathing problem. That is, not breathing at all. 9. What does the scouring of the Shire represent? While Tolkien despised allegory, let us not kid ourselves into thinking his books are devoid of thematic meaning. Some readers take the scouring as the final testing of the hobbits. However, I prefer the interpretation that is far more subversive. The Shire was the utopia, untouched by far, unknown to all. Saruman corrupting it, bringing Blacksmills to its fields, and turning it into a war zone, is far better read as Tolkien's rejection of that utopia. For those who fight in war, as Tolkien did in the First World War, its pain returns home. That dread and horror corrupts our inmost being. Though we might return to what was peaceful after the final battle, there is no happily ever after. Trauma touches our inmost being, and it is not something we walk away from when the war ends. 10. Albeit a manufactured one. 11. Except for the bad guys, because it usually ends up with them dying. 12. Or as I like to call it, love conquers all, and I swear we're not gay. 13. Tolkien thought this twist of Shakespeare's was terrible, and so decided to write a scene where the trees literally marched, the Ents on Isengard. 14. It probably helped that the protagonist, Spyro, was also a chosen one purple dragon. 15. Which I do realize is a terrible film, but if you take the time to listen to What it is saying, it does deal with some interesting thematic concepts. 16, though it should be noted that this becomes less the case as the series moves forward. 17, with the exception of the Avatar. 18, which, coincidentally, is also something you can say in a meeting room that everyone will agree with, whatever the context. 19, I had a lizard here for about 99% of the editing process. Who wants to write a soft magic story from the perspective of a lizard? 20, but, to be clear, Martin said, Targaryens are not immune to fire. This was about the birth of Dany's dragons, which was unique, magical, wondrous, a miracle. 21, while Valyrian magic did protect Dany from the fires of the burning pyre at the end of the first book, this is not a resolution of conflict in the usual way. She willingly walked into the flames, partly trusting her abilities, but also wishing to die with her loved one. It did not magically rescue her from a dangerous situation the author had written himself into, as she did not want to be rescued from it. Rather, the Valyrian magic interfered with her free and willing actions. It can hardly feel cheap if it does not give the character what they want without struggle. 22, which are presumably different systems, but there are theories that say they are all the same magic system with slightly different variations. 23, and before you recall Katara's line in the opening episode, it's not magic. Yes, it is. In terms of writing, it is magic. It's magic-y, and it does magic things. Pedantry is never attractive. 24, badly. The answer is badly. 25, a plot, narrative, and story are three different, debatable, but nonetheless distinct ideas. The distinct in the sense that it would be fruitless to try and explain their differences in a footnote. 26, one of the most common criticisms I received for this point was that supposedly, Zuko had no problem redirecting lightning, and that he only struggled with generating it. This is one possible reading of these two important episodes, but it is not the one I subscribe to. We never see if Zuko is capable of redirecting lightning prior to this moment, and I do not believe that he would have been able to even if he tried. The link between Zuko's character arc, letting go of his shame, and confronting his father, and mastering lightning, was made too clear by the writers for it to be a coincidence. It is possible, I think, that the writers originally conceived that Zuko would generate lightning at Ozai in the eclipse, fitting with a strict interpretation of the script of Bitter Work, but upon arriving at the episode could not find a way to logically have Zuko attack his powerless father. As such, they substituted it for redirection. Ultimately, redirection is an ability that relies on learning from other countries and not wholly relying on your own understanding. Zuko only does this is in deciding to join Team Avatar. For the writers to have not connected Zuko's character arc to lightning redirection, either Iroha's line is null and just a meaningless platitude that we never see bearing fruit, because even in the comics, Zuko has not yet generated lightning, or Zuko just happened to have never tried to generate lightning once he had resolved the inner tension that Iroha spoke about. That seems unlikely. The far more cohesive and narratively interesting interpretation is that Bitter Work sets up a character arc point for Zuko, and the eclipse sees it through. 27, it was explored in the first season, but given the isolated storytelling of Korra, referencing past character arcs, which are seemingly dealt with on a season-by-season basis, is not good storytelling. 28, well, not quite. 29, though the A Song of Ice and Fire series is a great example of a world where the gods might not be real, but magic is seemingly channeled through them anyway. 30, this generalization should be taken as such, a generalization. For the reasons detailed following, it is true that this tends to be the case, but there are enough examples of powerful polytheistic figures that anyone would be wrong to take this as an absolute rule. For example, pharaohs often grew their legitimacy by reference to the Egyptian pantheon, either being a god incarnate or blessed by the gods. The position of Pontifex Maximus in Roman society was an immensely powerful although not particularly political position, especially in the absence of a secular leader. 31, yes, ours was important, but remember how we were discussing that what really matters are the concerns of the average farmer on an ordinary day. They were far more concerned with Apollo, who was associated with the sun and music, and Artemis, goddess of the hunt, which brought them food. 32, otherwise known as discount Catholicism. 33, the Michael Kirkbride's law writings for the Elder Scrolls series brought this definition to light for me. That series uses it brilliantly, and is highly recommended to anyone with a passion for fascinating lore. 34, the Internet. God of I'm pretty sure I read somewhere. 35, this series has a markedly unsatisfying ending. 36, writers often begin from the starting point that the normal society has to be a mainstream human society that could be identified with today's modern culture, but this is not always the case. It would be fascinating to see a world in Which humans are the hidden society, e.g. daybreakers. 37 Though it should be noted he at first wholly confirmed them by locking her up, and basically torturing her. He was smart, though, so that part didn't turn out to be true. He later turned a little nicer. 38 Even though the removal of memories, however trivial, is arguably an intense violation of personal liberty and rights in the Enlightenment tradition. Carr and Berkel would be rolling in their graves, except I don't think they are dead. 39 I'm walking on air. 40 They are more of a secret society than a hidden world, but many of the same rules apply. 41 This is a gross oversimplification of how Britain's empire expanded, but there is some truth to it. They acquired extremely favorable trade deals, often violently, like in the case of Hong Kong, with nations where they could settle, but they enslaved those inhabitants of places where they could not settle, generally speaking. 42 This is not to say that being nationalistic requires racist, sexist, homophobic, or other such mentalities. 43 Though, it should be noted for academic honesty, that they were also horrifically treated by the British, and trade was not always in their favour, especially when it came to land. 44 I made the joke that this was not a high bar in the video, to which the many armchair historians assured me of how high a bar it really was. Yes, slavery was quite common. It was still just a joke. 45 Not sure how they have an empire given the whole exterminate all life thing, but apparently they do. One of the minimum requirements for an empire is people. 46 There are also a number of empires which purposefully imposed high tariffs on those they conquered to make it easy to purchase from their overlord, but hard to purchase from their local shoemaker. It all returned wealth to the homeland. 47 There are just about as many exceptions to this statement as there are examples of this statement, so do not take this as an absolute. However, it is a prevalent enough trope to make it worthy of discussion. 48 The Central Division, Middle Frontier, inherited by Lothari, actually incorporated a sliver of land between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. If history has taught us anything, it's that putting anything between the French and Germans is a tad prone to invasion. These lands lasted barely 20 years before being swallowed up by their Western and Eastern counterparts. 49 You rebel scum. Glory to Her Majesty's Empire. 50 Though, contrary to what the American education system seems to say, the British backed out because it was simply too costly, and they were fighting half a dozen wars at the same time. Well, it's more complex than that, but nobody wins wars with the magical power of patriotism. 51 In the video, there is this fantastic pun where I say, finally, let's talk about what happens when death plays the xylophone, repercussions. It doesn't quite translate that well to text. 52 This is going to be markedly difficult given that I don't really want to give away details of my stories. 53 Of which there are very few. 54 This does not mean I don't change it at all, but I tend to add to it more than I substitute or subtract from it. 55 For full credit to Writer in his video, Batman v Superman, the fundamental flaw of for articulating this idea better than I can. 56 Which, in my experience, don't usually offer much more than the basic structure.